Avoidants don't miss you when you leave. They miss you when your presence stops feeling guaranteed. Avoidants aren't triggered by distance. They're triggered by consistency suddenly disappearing. When you stop being the emotional anchor they secretly relied on, their mind starts replaying every moment you were steady, patient, and available. That's when missing you truly begins, not at the goodbye, but at the realization that you're no longer orbiting around their emotional chaos. Avoidants move through relationships believing they can always retreat into themselves. They depend on the idea that you'll stay, even when they pull away. Your reliability becomes the quiet safety they never had growing up, but it also becomes the thing they assume will never vanish. So when you finally withdraw your emotional availability, you interrupt the unconscious pattern they've relied on for years. Suddenly, the silence doesn't feel like protection. It feels like loss. And that's the moment their narrative begins to crumble. Avoidants don't miss people during conflict. They miss people during clarity. They miss them when the emotional fog clears. And they see, often too late, that they pushed away the one person who made connection feel less terrifying. They miss you when your absence stops being temporary and starts becoming your new normal. Because avoidants don't fear losing you, they fear needing you. And when you step back, they realize they needed you far more than they ever admitted, even to themselves. They start noticing things they never paid attention to before: the comfort of your presence, the softness of your tone, the way you understood what they couldn't articulate, the way you didn't rush their emotions, the way you held space without suffocating them. These moments were tiny for you, but grounding for them. Now, with distance, those memories grow louder. Your absence becomes a mirror, reflecting what they ran from and what they're left with. And what they're left with is a life that feels heavier without your emotional steadiness in it. Avoidance. Don't miss chaos. They miss the calm they never realized they depended on. The truth is, avoidance don't feel the loss all at once. It hits in waves. The first wave is confusion, a quiet discomfort they can't explain. The second wave is recognition, the truth settling in. They're not chasing me, they're really gone. The third wave is longing, not for the relationship, but for the version of themselves they became around you, a version capable of safety, softness, and emotional presence. Avoidants miss the parts of themselves your presence helped unlock. They miss the emotional ease you created. They miss the feeling of being understood without having to earn it. They miss the subtle warmth that made life feel less cold, even if they pretended they didn't need it. This is the moment the avoidant realizes the truth they spend their entire life avoiding. You can't push everyone away and expect the right people to stay forever. And when that realization hits, not with drama, not with begging, but with quiet grief, that's when an avoidant truly begins to miss you. Not because you left, but because your presence was never the problem. Their fear was, and now they're left with the emotional silence they chose but never actually wanted. They miss you when they realize no one else makes emotional safety look effortless. Avoidance craves safety, but fear needing anyone. You provided that safety without demanding anything from them. And when they try replacing you with distractions, they find something uncomfortable. Everyone else feels overwhelming, unpredictable, or exhausting. That contrast wakes them up because you weren't just different, you were grounding. What avoidants never admit, even to themselves, is that your presence made their nervous system relax in ways they didn't fully understand until it was gone. You didn't pressure them to open up. You didn't interrogate their silence. You didn't ask them to be someone they weren't ready to be. Instead, you created a space where they could exist without performance, without masks, without emotional hypervigilance. And that kind of safety doesn't just disappear, it lingers, becoming the standard by which all future connections are subconsciously measured. When they step into new situations, new conversations, new attempts at connection, something feels off, not because the other person is wrong, but because the emotional environment doesn't match the peace they once felt with you. Suddenly, everything feels louder. People seem needier, their reactions feel bigger, their energy feels heavier, and the avoidant, who once prided themselves on independence, starts to feel overstimulated by the emotional expectations of others. That's when the realization creeps in. The ease they had with you was rare, maybe even irreplaceable. They begin to understand that what you offered wasn't convenience, it was emotional shelter with other people. They feel watched, With you, they felt seen. With others, they feel evaluated. With you, they felt understood. With others, vulnerability feels like a risk. With you, vulnerability felt like relief. Avoidants don't miss people quickly. They miss the emotional landscapes people create. And the landscape you offered was soft, steady, predictable in the ways that mattered, and gentle in the ways they didn't know they longed for. When they lose that, they don't just lose you, they lose the version of themselves capable of relaxing into intimacy instead of running from it. At first, they distract themselves with noise, new conversations, work, hobbies, anything to avoid the discomfort of missing something meaningful. But every distraction eventually collapses under the same truth. No one else feels like home. No one else brings that calm into their chest. No one else slows their racing thoughts. No one else offers connection without pressure, interest without expectation, presence without demand. The avoidant begins to notice the absence of your emotional steadiness in the smallest moments, the way they have to explain themselves more, the way they feel judged for their silence, the way their avoidant tendencies get misinterpreted as disinterest instead of fear. With you, they never had to justify their internal world. Others expect clarity, consistency, language. You understood the spaces between the lines. That kind of understanding becomes a memory that refuses to fade. And when the avoidant realizes not everyone offers love without suffocation, connection without chaos, or presence without pressure, that's when missing you becomes unavoidable. Because the truth hits them harder than they expected. Emotional safety wasn't something you tried to give, it was something you naturally embodied. And once an avoidant experiences that, every other connection feels like static. Every other bond feels heavier. Every other person feels like work. That's when they miss you. Not out of nostalgia, not out of loneliness, but because losing the safest emotional space they ever knew forces them to confront the one thing they never wanted to admit. Losing you wasn't just losing someone, it was losing peace. Avoidants feel your absence when they finally see their patterns have consequences. They believe pulling away keeps them safe. But when you stop chasing, stop fixing, stop proving yourself, their avoidance hits a wall. Suddenly, there's silence they didn't choose, distance they didn't control, and a loss they never prepared for. That's when missing you stops being a possibility and becomes a reality they can't escape. Avoidants spend years believing that withdrawing protects them from emotional overwhelm, conflict, or vulnerability. To them, distance is a defense mechanism, a shield, a way to regulate feelings they never learned how to manage. But that defense only works if someone on the other side is still trying, still reaching, still holding, still bridging the gap they keep creating. When you finally stop carrying the emotional load, something shifts. Their pattern, the one they relied on to keep themselves comfortable, suddenly backfires. The silence they once used as a weapon becomes a mirror, and in that mirror they see the truth they've spent their whole life avoiding. Pulling away doesn't stop loss. Sometimes it causes it, and when an avoidant realizes that you walked away not out of anger but out of exhaustion, their internal narrative collapses. Because they expected your patience to be endless, your understanding to be unconditional, your presence to be permanent. Losing you wasn't part of the script. At first, they tell themselves they're fine. They distract themselves with routine, convince themselves distance is familiar, even comforting. But then slowly, your absence begins to seep into the quiet corners of their life, the moments they would text you, the times they would seek your perspective, the emotional weight you once helped them carry. Your silence becomes a sensation they can't numb. It forces them to confront something they avoided for years. Their patterns don't protect them, their patterns isolate them. And the moment that truth hits, it hits hard. They start replaying their own behavior, the pulling back, the shutting down, the cold responses, the mixed signals, the emotional detours they created every time connection felt too close. They see the cycles clearly now, not as strategies for survival, but as habits that cost them the one person who genuinely cared. That realization triggers a different kind of missing, not impulsive, not dramatic, but quiet and unsettling. It's the kind of missing that sits in their chest like a weight they can't name. They miss the emotional safety you gave them without asking for anything in return. They miss the comfort of knowing someone understood their silence instead of misinterpreting it. They miss the simplicity of your presence the steady reassurance that even if they pulled away, you wouldn't vanish. But now you have vanished, and they're forced to face the part of themselves they tried so hard to outrun. When an avoidant realizes their pattern caused the loss, they don't break down in front of anyone. They break inward. The guilt hits, the regret surfaces, and the fear they tried to hide from becomes undeniable. They feel your absence not as emptiness, but as accountability. The realization that actions have consequences, that distance has a cost, that pushing away has a price. They start wondering if they waited too long to change, if they took your effort for granted, if they confused your patience with permanence. And the truth they can't escape is this: you didn't walk away to punish them. You walked away to protect yourself from the emotional treadmill they kept you running on. And losing someone who loved them gently, consistently, and genuinely becomes the wake-up call they never asked for but desperately needed. Because for the first time, they see their avoidance not as a shield, but as the reason they're alone. They miss you when your energy stops being a soft place to land. Avoidants underestimate the emotional labor you carry. They assume you'll always soothe everything, make things easy, make them feel understood, make the world lighter. But when you pull that energy back, they feel the weight of life without your warmth. It hits them. You weren't clingy, you were there calm. Avoidants don't realize how much they rely on the emotional stability of another person until it disappears. They take for granted the softness you brought into the connection, the way you listened without judgment, the way you sensed their discomfort before they said a word, the way you diffused tension without making them feel cornered. To them, this was simply how things were, not something you actively gave. But the moment your energy shifts, the entire emotional climate of their world changes. What once felt breathable now feels tight. What once felt manageable now feels overwhelming. What once felt steady now feels unpredictable. You are their emotional buffer, the quiet safety net under every moment of withdrawal, confusion, and shutdown. You didn't force them to open up. You created an atmosphere where opening up felt less dangerous. But avoidants often mistake effortlessness for effortlessness, meaning they assume what feels natural for you costs you nothing. In reality, it costs you a lot. It costs you patience, self-regulation, emotional bandwidth, compassion, and endurance. And when you finally retract that energy, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, they feel the emotional imbalance instantly. They feel the drop in warmth. They feel the absence of your presence. They feel the coldness of the world without your filter softening it. And that's when missing you begins in a way they can't rationalize or avoid. Because your calm wasn't just comforting, it was regulating. Your presence stabilized their internal chaos. Your empathy translated their feelings back to them in a language they could understand. Your energy made their world feel navigable rather than threatening. Remove that, and their emotional system starts short-circuiting. Suddenly, small inconveniences feel bigger. Small misunderstandings feel sharper. Their own thoughts grow louder, harsher, harder to manage without the grounding effect of your emotional steadiness. They don't just miss you, they miss who they were around you. They miss the softer version of themselves you brought forward. They miss the safety in your voice, the reassurance in your presence, the quiet confidence they felt just by knowing you cared. And here's the truth they never expected to face. You were never the source of pressure. You were the source of peace when your energy disappears. They realized they weren't running from you. They were running from the vulnerability you awakened in them, a vulnerability that felt scary but also healing. And when you step back, they understand too late how much they depended on your emotional glow to illuminate the parts of their world they couldn't navigate alone. Without you, they feel exposed. Not just to emotions, but to themselves. Because your calm gave them courage. Your softness gave them safety. Your presence gave them direction. Losing that isn't losing a person. It's losing the atmosphere that made life feel survivable. That's why the missing hits deep. Not because you were clingy, but because you were their sanctuary. And sanctuaries are never appreciated until the doors close. Avoidants miss you the moment they realize your silence is peace, not punishment. When you stop pushing for clarity, stop trying to repair every disconnect, stop explaining your heart, they recognize something terrifying. You're not waiting anymore. Your silence isn't a game, it's acceptance. And nothing makes an avoidant miss you faster than realizing the emotional door they kept half open is closing without drama. Avoidants are used to silence as a strategy, a way to create space, reduce intensity, and regain emotional control. But the silence they're used to is the kind you break. Their silence depends on your willingness to bridge the gap, soothe the tension, and make the relationship feel safe again. So when the silence suddenly comes from you, not them, and stays, it shakes their foundation. Because your silence isn't cold or punishing, it's calm. It's final. It's the kind of silence that comes from someone who has nothing left to prove, nothing left to fix, nothing left to hold on to. And that's the exact moment the avoidance internal script starts to unravel. They don't panic because you slammed the door. They panic because you didn't. Avoidants are comfortable with conflict, withdrawal, and mixed signals, but they are not comfortable with neutrality. Neutrality means acceptance. Neutrality means detachment. Neutrality means you finally see the truth. Their patterns aren't personal, and you're no longer willing to shrink yourself to fit inside them. That realization hits them in a way they didn't prepare for. Suddenly, the silence doesn't feel spacious. It feels empty. It doesn't feel protective. It feels isolating. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like loss. Because for the first time, they can't feel you reaching for them through the quiet, your emotional presence once a constant comfort is gone. And it's not gone with anger or resentment. It's gone with acceptance. The most powerful and unsettling shift an avoidant can experience. It forces them to confront something they never wanted to admit. You're not trying anymore. They can no longer rely on your predictable love, your predictable understanding, your predictable effort. They can no longer assume you'll pick up the emotional slack or mend the cracks in the connection. Your silence becomes a new kind of communication, one they can't control, influence, or escape. And that's when the missing begins to bloom. Not the impulsive missing of someone who wants attention, not the dramatic missing of someone who fears abandonment, but the quiet internal missing that comes from realizing they misjudged your staying power and misused your patience. They start remembering all the times you tried to talk through things. Understand them, understand the relationship, understand their silence. They remember how you showed up consistently, even when they pulled back. They remember how you softened your truth so they wouldn't feel overwhelmed, how you held space when they shut down, how you kept choosing connection even when they chose distance. And now, with nothing left for you to offer, they finally see the truth you carried all along. Your love was never a threat, it was a gift. A gift they assumed would always be there. But when that gift is gone, replaced by a silence that feels like peace instead of pain, the avoidant feels something unfamiliar: consequences. Not punishment, but the natural outcome of their own patterns. And that's when missing you stops being a thought and becomes an ache. Because they didn't just lose someone who cared, they lost someone who cared calmly, purely, consistently. And that kind of presence is never forgotten, especially when the silence that replaces it feels safer for you and lonelier for them. They miss you when they finally understand you didn't want control. You wanted connection. Avoidants often mistake your care for pressure. But when you're gone, they start reinterpreting everything you did: the patience, the effort, the vulnerability. And the truth becomes painfully clear. You weren't asking for too much. You were offering exactly what they've always been afraid to want. Avoidants carry a lifelong fear of being consumed, trapped, or emotionally overpowered. So even the gentlest forms of closeness can feel like expectations they're terrified of failing. When you were there, your love felt overwhelming, not because it was, but because it illuminated their own inability to show up emotionally. They mistook your emotional openness for demands, your consistency for pressure, your honesty for intensity. But once your presence is gone, once your emotional energy is no longer wrapping around their fears like a protective blanket, they finally see the reality behind your intentions. They begin replaying conversations, moments, gestures they once brushed off. They remember how you listened, how you adapted, how you gave space without disappearing, how you expressed your needs without attacking theirs. And suddenly, your care no longer feels suffocating. It feels rare. It feels meaningful. It feels like everything they told themselves they didn't need, but now crave in the quiet moments where your absence stings the most. The avoidant mind works in hindsight. They understand connection after it's been withdrawn. Distance gives them clarity in ways closeness never could. So when you're gone, they start editing their old assumptions through a new emotional lens, one that reveals how deeply they misread your intentions. What they once experienced as pressure now looks like patience. What they once interpreted as neediness now looks like emotional investment. What they once labeled too much now looks like a healthy form of intimacy they weren't ready to accept. And that's when the ache begins. The ache of realizing you weren't trying to control the relationship. You were trying to nurture it. You weren't forcing closeness. You were inviting it. You weren't demanding more of them. You were offering more of yourself. And avoidants miss that deeply, painfully, quietly, because they know you didn't leave because you wanted to. You left because they didn't meet you halfway, not because you expected perfection, but because you deserved reciprocity. They start recognizing small things, how they shut down when you opened up, how they avoided important conversations, how they kept emotional walls high while you kept showing up with open hands. They see how hard you tried, not because you were desperate, but because you genuinely cared. When they connect those dots, they're hit with a truth they avoided for years. You didn't want control. You wanted closeness. You didn't want to manage them. You wanted to understand them. You didn't want power. You wanted partnership. This realization cuts deeper than guilt. It touches something they've hidden from the world, the desire to feel chosen without feeling trapped, loved without feeling overwhelmed, seen without feeling exposed. With you, they were safe, but safety requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability, something they ran from because it felt like danger. Now your absence becomes the mirror reflecting what their fear cost them. They don't just miss you, they miss the emotional possibility they lost. The version of themselves they might have become if they'd taken just one more step toward you instead of retreating. The connection they sabotaged, not because it was wrong, but because it was real. And the truth is undeniable. You weren't asking for too much. They were giving too little. And now they feel the void that only your kind of connection could fill. A void they created through misunderstanding, fear, and emotional reflexes that kept love at arm's length. That's when missing you becomes not just emotional, but transformational. Avoidants miss you when your absence feels safer than their old defense mechanisms. Avoidants don't miss you the moment you leave. They miss you the moment your silence exposes what their defenses were protecting them from. Your presence felt like a risk, but your absence becomes a mirror. And mirrors don't lie, even when avoidants try to. When they were with you, the connection felt overwhelming. Not because you were intense, but because your emotional honesty forced them to feel things they've spent their whole life running from. You didn't just show up with affection. You showed up with depth. You brought consistency. You brought vulnerability. You brought presence. And for an avoidant, all of that feels like standing in the sun without shade. Warm but blinding. Safe but terrifying. So they did what avoidants do. They pushed. They distanced. They shut down. Not because they didn't care, but because caring woke up a version of themselves they didn't know how to handle. But when you leave, something shifts. Silence becomes louder than any argument. Distance becomes heavier than any conflict. And the lack of your energy, the one that always softened their edges, becomes a truth they can't run from. This is the part no one talks about. Avoidants don't miss your presence. They miss the safety they never realized your presence created. At first, they tell themselves they're fine. They lean on old habits, distraction, disconnecting, going numb, pretending they're unaffected. But the truth sneaks in quietly. It hits them when they notice they're no longer being emotionally chased. Their nervous system isn't overloaded anymore, but it feels empty. The stability they took for granted is gone. The person who understood them without forcing them is silent. And suddenly your absence feels safer than their defenses ever did, because their defenses cost them something real. Their silence pushed away someone who wasn't trying to control them, someone who was trying to connect. That's the moment the truth lands hard. They didn't avoid you. They avoided the feelings you awakened in them. Feelings like being seen without running, being valued without performing, being loved without earning it, being emotionally safe for the first time in years, maybe ever. You didn't scare them. Their own openness scared them.
When an avoidant pushes away someone who made connection feel possible, the loss doesn't feel clean.
It feels confusing, haunting, unfinished, because they know deep down your absence isn't punishment, it's clarity. Your silence isn't a game, it's a boundary. Your distance isn't revenge, it's protection. And that's why they miss you. Not because you were always there, but because now you aren't. Their old coping mechanisms once felt like safety. But your absence proves that safety wasn't protection, it was avoidance. Avoidance that cost them someone who brought out parts of them they secretly wanted but didn't know how to hold. And when that realization hits, the avoidant finally feels the one emotion they try hardest to escape: regret. Not because you're gone, but because losing you made them realize they were never running from you. They were running from their own capacity to feel deeply. And now the feelings you awakened are still there with no one to anchor them. That's the moment an avoidant truly starts missing you, when your silence becomes the truth they can't defend themselves from.